Hey there, welcome to Broadband Deployment News. If you're an internet service provider, you may be wondering what the new FCC net neutrality regulations will mean to you. Be right back and we'll take a look at that. Thanks for joining me, Rick Husey here with Broadband Deployment News. So I did want to take a look at this because some ISPs may be not sure what it all means yet, haven't dug into it. So this is in the Keller and Heckman law blog, what ISPs need to know about the FCC's Title II Open Internet Order. Just a little back history. So, net neutrality was implemented during the Obama administration. And then a couple years later, when the Trump administration came in, those regulations were pulled back. And now, just recently, they were waiting to get the final person on the FCC, appointed by the Biden administration. But once that happened, they went in and pushed forward again on net neutrality. So that just happened recently. You see here, May 7th. So that's where we are today. There's a question as to whether those regulations will be deemed appropriate by the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court is currently looking at a couple of cases that have nothing to do with broadband or telecom. They're looking at fish monitoring cases, and they're looking at a specific thing called a major questions doctrine, and whether or not that determines on a major question whether an agency has the authority to make their own decisions, or if that needs to go back to the courts, or if, for example, if Congress was not clear in the law, then the agency in the past has had a lot of leeway on how they can interpret things, and now the Supreme Court in recent years has been pulling back on that and saying that unless it's a really major, if it is a major question, then it needs to be looked at further, that the agency does not have the authority to do that. So it's very possible that, again, a couple of these cases that are coming down, that may set a precedent for something like this, and these rules may not actually be able to go into effect, or at least stay into effect. So, but I was going to read through this and just talk about a little bit about what they're saying here is in the rules. I think this will help because it's a good summary. So on May 7th, 2024, the FCC released a declaratory ruling reclassifying broadband internet access service, or BIAS, as a telecommunications service subject to the jurisdiction of the FCC under Title II of the Communications Act. That's the Communications Act of 1996. And in that act, there are two services specified. There's telecommunications service and there's information services. And that's one reason why this could well be stricken down, is because information services is a separate category in there. So Congress was pretty clear when they were doing that now, internet was still new then, and we had dial-up internet. We didn't have all of the broadband options we have today, but internet was still new at that time. But it was classified as telecommunications services and information services. But what the FCC has done through this ruling is said broadband internet service is going to now be a telecommunications service, which will give them more regulatory control, like they have over phone companies, for example. So that's another reason, because not only was, again, if Congress is not clear, then there's a question. If it's a major question, then, does the agency have the authority to do that? Well, if Congress, it seems like here Congress was clear that internet services, information services, was separate from telecommunication services. Again, this all is going to have to be adjudicated. We'll see what happens there. But that's kind of the background. Ultimately, however, the order is notable less for its immediate impact on ISPs than for the long-term structural change it represents. The order, if it survives legal challenge, gives the FCC jurisdictional authority over the dominant communications medium of modern times. And as you see, they say if it does survive that legal challenge or legal challenges. So, scope of reclassification, again, broadband internet access service. The order applies to broadband internet access service, defined as a mass market retail service by wire or radio that provides the capability to transmit data to and receive data from all or substantially all internet endpoints, including any capabilities that are incidental to and enable the operation of the communication service, but excluding dial-up internet access service. It's funny that it excludes dial-up. So few people have it. And I also wonder if that's because, again, when the Act came out in 1996, that's pretty much all there was, as far as, let's say, residential internet services. Certainly, you had dial-up. So if you take that out, then you can say, well, back in 1996, that was referring to dial-up. And we're not talking about that today. So that may be why they specifically mentioned dial-up was not included, because I don't know how many people still have dial-up internet. There may be a few, unfortunately, but they are suffering with that. It's not like they chose to have that. They're suffering because there's no other option. They can't afford, let's say, satellite internet at $100 or more per month, that kind of thing. If it's available in their area, dial-up. I suppose there's still some providers in certain places. Access to poles, ducts, and rights of way. And as ISPs look at this stuff, they may be thinking, hey, this is good. We need this. So the real concern was, does this give the FCC more authority than they should have? Is it going to lead to some bad things later with more and more regulatory authority? But some of the things that this emphasizes are positive things, but there are also things, honestly, that could be done without net neutrality, because again, these are things that are not net neutrality related. So it's not about net neutral internet traffic so much as it's providing the FCC, they believe, with the authority to be able to do some of these things. However, a lot of these things they could do or were doing already. They've already been talking about poles and access rights of way, and they've already been talking, as we'll see here in a minute, about bulk billing on multiple dwelling units. So a lot of the stuff they could do anyway. They didn't really need this. But you see here access to poles, ducts, and rights of way, ensuring that broadband operators or broadband service only providers receive the same statutory protections for pole attachments guaranteed by Section 224 of the Act that providers of cable and telecommunications services receive, thereby promoting greater deployment, competition, and availability of broadband services. Those providers will be statutorily guaranteed a right of non-discriminatory access and will also be entitled by statute to the same rates as their competitors. So again, these are things I think they could already do, but they're saying under this, we're saying this will be the case. Access to public rights of way. No state or local statute or regulation or other state or local legal requirement may prohibit or have the effect of prohibiting the ability of any entity to provide any interstate or intrastate telecommunications service. MTE access, it's multiple tenant, instead of multiple dwelling unit, multiple tenant something, I forget what the E stands for. Enables the FCC to regulate broadband-only providers that serve MTEs and thereby end unfair, unreasonable, and anti-competitive practices facing residents of those units. The order empowers the FCC to apply those providers the same prohibitions against exclusive MTE contracts that currently apply to telecommunications carriers. And again, they're already doing this with they've already put forward a bulk billing prohibition where they didn't need the net neutrality rules to do that, but they're saying this is giving them that ability. So exclusive access, graduated revenue sharing, and exclusive revenue sharing agreements, and it requires disclosure of others, for example, exclusive marketing agreements. So again, this is saying that, again, they've already got a proposed rulemaking out on this, but this is saying that apartment owner or building owners, for example, cannot strike up an exclusive relationship with a local cable company and then restrict other people from coming in to provide those services, whether that, let's say, be video or broadband over those same inside wiring to those buildings. So again, already there, but they're saying that this is part of the net neutrality rules as well. USF reform, Universal Service Fund. The FCC forbears for now from applying rules promulgated under that section that would require federal Universal Service Fund contributions by ISPs. So that's something that a lot of people have been saying is that, and I believe this as well, is that if we're going to have a program like the Affordable Connectivity Program, the ACP, where some certain low-income folks are going to get subsidies for their broadband service, that it should be something that is on the bills of those that can afford broadband service, as well as maybe a few other places where we can get that revenue from. And it should not be something that is coming from taxpayers' pockets and something that has to be constantly approved every year. Just make it like part of the USF. The USF right now helps fund broadband and telecom services in very rural areas. And eventually we're going to be at a point where, with BEAD money and everything, it's not going to be so much about having to fund, like we had RDOF that was part of USF funds that was funding broadband deployment. We're not going to need that anymore to the extent that we need that now, especially once the BEAD dollars are out there. So it should be that we would have the funds, I would think, to do that. But they're saying that the bills for everybody would go way up, and that's going to make broadband less affordable. Well, right now, if we kind of refocus what we're doing with USF toward broadband, I don't think it would make that much of a difference. I think we'd still have a USF fee on our bills. It would still be, right now it's on phone bills and it's not on broadband bills. That's a difference. So it would be something that would be added to the broadband bill. I would still think it would be something similar to a, $4 or $5 fee that you see on your phone bill right now, and that would help to then provide broadband service to those who can't afford it, as opposed to taxpayer money. Because what we have right now with the Affordable Care or Connectivity Program is that over 4 out of every 10 households actually are eligible for that. So that means 6 households out of 10 are supporting 4 households. So there's way too many, I think, that are eligible for it. Plus, any new programs that go forward probably should not let people take the subsidy that they get and apply it to a more expensive plan. There should be a low-cost plan, something like $30, that would provide more than what they need to be able to participate in the digital economy, and they can use the subsidy for that. They can't, if they can afford more, they shouldn't be able to apply a $30 package to a $60 plan. If they can afford $30, then you see what I'm saying? So because it expands the base of people that have to get it, and therefore everybody else is having to pay more. When there's people that can afford broadband, they just can't afford the fastest broadband that they want. So we shouldn't be subsidizing a gigabit broadband if somebody can afford the low-cost plan, is I guess what I'm saying there. Let's see. ETC designation for broadband service providers, high cost, and lifeline support. So the order enables broadband providers to be designated as ETCs, that's an eligible telecommunications carrier, without a voice service requirement, allowing those providers to be theoretically eligible for support under the high cost and lifeline programs. So right now, you've got Lifeline, those kinds of services, you have to be an ETC, and I think what they're saying here is they would not have to have a voice service requirement as part of their service. So maybe that's broadband service only is what they're saying there. It does say the order stops short of designating broadband providers as a supported service under the USF. So anyway, that one's a little confusing to me. CPNI privacy. So CPNI, those are the rules for voice providers, so that they have to be very careful on who they provide access to. For example, call detail records is a big part of that, where you don't want somebody to be able to call up the support group at a phone service and say, hey, can you give me my call detail records for the last month? And it's actually somebody who's pretending to be somebody else, and then you have the calling records for an individual going to somebody else who might exploit that for some reason. So CPNI rules and privacy are all around that on the phone side, and they're talking about, here you see CPNI rules are heavily voice specific and not readily applied to the broadband in the broadband context. The order indicates that the FCC will launch a proceeding in the near future to modify the CPNI rules for application to broadband providers, or broadband service. Given the ongoing state and federal debate surrounding ISP privacy issues, this promises to be a complicated and hotly contested rulemaking. So this is more about internet privacy. I don't know, it's not really CPNI. Yeah, I mean, I guess you could call it that, but it's very similar. In Europe they have very strict rules as far as what you can do as far as with cookies. That's when you go to a website now. You'll see they say, hey, here's how we use your cookies. You can opt in for all of them. And in a lot of cases they'll say, here's if you want to opt in for only some of them. The cookies could be used for, some are strictly necessary to make sure the site, they just have to be there. One cookie has to be there to determine whether or not you want cookies. you at least need that. But then you've also got, cookies for performance, cookies maybe for tracking where you were on the site for your own benefit, and then also targeting cookies, which would be marketing cookies. And that's the one that a lot of people have issues with. Or just some people just don't want to know, they just don't want the cookies at all. So you can always turn those off. But if you do, then the site might not work the way you want it to. But so there may be some additional, rules coming up or something like that about internet privacy. Again, all of that I think could be done without net neutrality rules, because again, this is not about net neutrality. It could be done, I believe, without reclassifying broadband providers in this way. But this is part of what they're talking about here is doing that, but looking at that later. State and local preemption. Given the federal reclassification, can state utility commissions opt to require broadband providers to obtain state certification as a telecommunications carrier and be subject to state telecommunications regulations? The order does not provide useful guidance on this. The FCC declined to categorically preempt all state or local regulation affecting broadband in the absence of any specific determination that such regulation interferes with our exercise of federal regulatory authority. In essence, the FCC intends to consider state and local preemption issues on a case-by-case basis. Nevertheless, we maintain the status quo with respect to states' ability to impose state-level contribution obligations on the provisions of broadband internet service for state universal or for state service programs. I don't know what that status quo is. I don't know if that means they can't or they can. Network slicing. Network slicing is something that came out, was certainly emphasized with 5G and 6G. Started with 5G mobile service, where mobile providers can slice up basically they're slicing. They can slice up the spectrum basically, and they can allow certain applications that require maybe faster access or lower latency, those kinds of things. You can slice it up based on the application. So it's a really good feature to be able to do. There's also questions as to whether that creates fast lanes. So it depends, I guess, on what you're using that slicing for. So this was a real concern. Could this be with network slicing now? If you don't address that, could that mean that fast lanes will come back? The fast lanes were where there was this issue where I think it was Comcast was wanting to charge certain streamers like Netflix the ability to have faster access to their subscribers, because at that time, the amount of video that was the escalation in video traffic was really causing a lot of issues for internet service providers. So you had Netflix and others that were using all kinds of bandwidth on the internet service provider's network, and the service providers were not getting paid for that anymore. Any addition, I should say. They had a big increase in bandwidth. The streamers were not paying for that. They were getting paid by each individual subscriber, but they were not getting paid for all of the bandwidth that was being used for their services. So I think Comcast and maybe a few others, I don't know, but they set up what were called fast lanes, and that was deemed to be kind of not net neutral, because it was, it was basically maybe hindering some new entrants in the market, or it was making, if you're making one streamer faster, then that means maybe you're making other streamers slower. Really what you're doing is you're prioritizing the traffic for one streamer over another, and that would mean their streaming service would probably work better. So that was the issue there. It says the order defines network slicing as a technique that enables mobile network operators to create multiple virtualized subnetworks, each known as a slice, using shared physical wireless network infrastructure and common computing resources. So again, you're taking that single bit of spectrum, but you're slicing it up and being able to treat it or prioritize it differently using these virtualized subnetworks. The debate involved questions of whether network slicing presented an open internet problem and whether it should be classified as a broadband service or not a broadband service. Given the nascent or new nature of network slicing, we conclude that it is not appropriate at this time to make a categorical determination regarding all network slicing and the services delivered through the use of network slicing. We agree that we should not allow network slicing to be used to evade the open internet rules that we adopt. In other words, they're saying network slicing could be good depending on how it's used, but we want to make sure it's not used to evade the rules, and I think that would mean the fast lanes, as we'll see here. It says we clarify that a bias or broadband provider's decision to speed up on the basis of internet content, applications, or services would impair or degrade other content applications or services which are not given the same treatment. A fast lane, in other words, may present an open internet violation. Now again, one of the reasons to do this is because certain applications you want to have, there's certain applications that are going to be sending a lot of data all at once, and they could cause congestion, whereas you got other applications that don't. Maybe it's IoT devices that are monitoring temperatures or just sending little bits of data at a time, and you want them to be fast. You want low latency for various things. You don't want them to get behind. It's kind of like the fast lane at the grocery store. If you just have a little bit of stuff that you do want to get, you don't want to stand in the lane that's got 5 people with full carts. You want to get in a place where it's 10 items or less, and you can go. You don't want to be behind all that. So there's different things that you can do with network slicing that are based on applications and what the application is doing. So they're going to have to look at each case on a case-by-case basis here as well. While the network slicing debate has tended to focus on mobile network operators, and the order's definition of the term network slicing is limited to mobile network operators, similar issues could conceivably apply to wireline services as well at some point. Indeed, the NCTA submitted an ex parte comments suggestion that NCTA does not explicitly oppose the mobile carrier's push to allow network slicing, but rather seeks to ensure that wireline providers would receive comparable treatment. So they're just saying if the mobile operators can do network slicing for various applications, we'd like the ability to do that as well, and they should not be given special treatment there. No rate regulation. The order and this was a big concern for operators, is that this would give the ability for the FCC to say, okay, broadband operators, you have to offer a low-cost product, and it has to be at this price. The government is trying to get all operators, certainly that are accepting BEAD funding, to offer a low-cost product, but they're not necessarily stating what that price should be. They're leaving that up to the internet service providers and the states to work out on what that should be based on. And then the states are going to determine who should get the money based on that as well. That's going to be one of the scoring things, I'm sure. So no rate regulation. The order explicitly forbears from applying sections 201 and 202 to the extent that they would permit rate regulation by the FCC. The FCC made clear statements in the order indicating that rate regulation is not an objective, and the order does not allow it. Whether the order acts to preempt state affordability programs, to the extent such programs are considered rate regulation, is an open question. And that, what brings that up is this is the New York budget that came out a year or two ago that said all internet service providers have to provide service. I think it was maybe at $15. They had to have a $15 plan for, and I'm making up numbers now. I think it was 15, and I believe it might have been 50 meg that they had to provide, and then it would be $30 if it was 100 meg. Again, I might be making up numbers here, but it was something like that. So they had that in the budget. It was struck down by a court, and then another court came back just recently and said, hey, it's okay, you can do that. They reversed the lower court decision. Well, this might reverse that decision, because if the FCC is saying that there's no rate regulation, it could be that they have then, as a federal entity, basically prevent any states from doing something that they say should not be done. So I think that's a question. Not public utility regulation. So despite bringing broadband service into the same regulatory fold as telephone service, the FCC maintained that the order is not analogous to public utility regulation. Again, this would be the idea of treating broadband providers as a utility. While it may be a utility-like service, it's not a public utility from the standpoint of it's not, again, rate regulation is one thing that public utilities are under quite often. So if you've got a local gas provider, or maybe a power, a public utility providing power in your area, a lot of times there's a public utility commission that looks at that and sets the rates. And it tends to be because that's the only place you can get that service. There's not any competing services. Now, I know a lot of people will say, well, I have a monopoly provider in my area. There's only one service. That's less and less the case with satellite and with fixed wireless. And obviously satellite's going to be more expensive. It's not going to be competitive. But so anyway, this is another thing that internet service providers were concerned about, was the fact that this was making it like a public utility. They say, unlike the range of utility-style regulations that were applied to monopoly telephone service under Title II, including rate regulation, we forbear from many of these provisions and do not adopt any rate regulation, which is a hallmark of utility regulation. So there you go. This is, again, a good summary. I linked to this in the description of the video, so you can read through the rest of that full again if you want. This is a good resource as well, this Lexology and this Keller and Heckman, good resource for telecommunications kinds of questions. So, again, as you look at this, very little of it has to do with actual net neutrality. It's really more about what power the FCC has to regulate broadband providers, not so much about net neutrality. Again, the network slicing is something that could be, possibly a threat to open internet if it's done in a certain way. But most of it is about what the FCC can do. But again, a lot of this stuff they could already do. They have already done. And even on net neutrality things, they had already resolved issues like the fast lanes. I think the fast lanes, pretty sure that was resolved prior to any network or net neutrality regulations. And there were other things where providers were throttling competing services. A cable company might throttle a competing streaming video service that was over the top, and that was deemed wrong, and they got a slap on the wrist and told not to do it, and they stopped doing it. So the FCC still had that power. But anyway, it's good to know what some of the summary things that are in there. So check that out further if you want to. And thanks for joining me today. I appreciate it. If you're not subscribed to our channel, click the subscribe button, ring the bell to be notified when I'm live. If you like the video, give me a thumbs up. I'd appreciate that. And I will see you next time. Bye-bye.